Okay, well, welcome everybody to Solar Noon Tuesday. And as per usual, going to start with some of the headlines for the week of April 3rd. There is quite a bit of little contradictory news sort of in this week's mix. The EIA just released data that shows that renewables on the US grid actually surpassed coal from generating capacity in 2025. And this comes on the heel of the fact that they surpassed coal or they surpassed nuclear in 2020. So renewables in the last couple of years have gone from fourth place to second place. Currently, wind and solar make up about 14% of the grid's generating capacity, hydro about 6%. And then others, geothermal, biomass, things like that, they make up another 3%. So total, about 23% on the grid. This compares to coal, which represents about 20% of the generating capacity. Nuclear represents about 18%. And natural gas is still the big dog there with 40%. Although, as we've talked about in the past, some of the anticipated installations of natural gas are going to decline dramatically over the next several years. So we'll see some of that change. House Bill 1 was recently passed by the United States House of Representatives. This is dubbed the Lower Energy Cost Act, which in my skepticism, I assume no matter what they call these bills, the intention is usually the opposite of the bill title. But anyway, it was essentially along party lines. There were 4 Democrats who voted for it, 1 Republican voted against it. What this does is it really is designed to incentivize or lower the cost of fossil fuel production in the United States. It's giving greater access to public lands for mining and drilling. It's reducing a lot of the permitting time and cost for mining and drilling in the US. And it repeals the penalties or costs associated with methane emissions that were enacted as part of the Inflation Reduction Act. So all of these in combination are really designed to make the exploitation of fossil fuels easier, less costly. Now that goes on to the Senate, where Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer has said it is dead on arrival. So I think we're really just dealing with political theater at the moment. It's not going to get through the Senate. The North Carolina Utilities Commission has changed the net metering laws in that state. What they've done, it's kind of a mixed bag here. Again, part of the mixed signal kind of situation we're facing, where they're adding a $10 fee to those people who have solar arrays on their homes or businesses, a monthly fee of $10. They are moving to a time of use billing structure. So that's where, of course, you pay different rates depending on the demand on the grid at the moment. And then they're also lowering the net metering compensation to customers as they're feeding it in back to the utility. But they are adding a 36-cent per watt incentive program that is to incentivize adding solar and storage on your facility. But studies have shown that these changes will, in total, result with about a drop of 25 to 35% in the compensation that people receive from the utility for net metering. The largest installation, the largest solar installation in Illinois has just broken ground. This is being developed by a company called Swift Current Energy, and the project is called the Double Black Diamond Projects. It's a very large project. It's located in central Illinois near Springfield, and it will produce about 800 megawatts when it's completed, about 1.6 million panels. This will be over a 2-county area, not the whole counties, but spread over 2 counties. They're anticipating the project will install about 435 installers, should be operational by the end of next year, 2024. And they do anticipate that this will bring about $100 million in tax revenue to those two counties, which is Sangamon, I think it is, and Morgan County in Illinois. So a large project there. And a new analysis by AREA, which is the International Renewable Energies Agency, has said that in order for the world to meet the 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature rise that was part of the Paris Agreement, that the world will have to install about 1,000 gigawatts of renewable energy each and every year between now and 2030. That to compare, currently there's about 3,000 gigawatts in total. So, oh, the screen share, they're saying the screen share isn't on. Is that right?
I think it is.
Oh, okay. Somebody just said it wasn't. So
I see the same pop-ups that you usually have.
Okay, good.
Yeah, so do I. I see it.
Okay. All right. So anyway, to get to that, they're anticipating currently the worldwide we're installing about, or we're paying about $1.3 trillion per year in this investment in renewable energy. AREA says that investment's going to have to kick up to about $5 trillion a year. And I put this screen image here because it's interesting. Just 5 years ago, they were projecting that it was only about $737 billion that was going to be needed. So the renewable energy is such a moving target, and all of these projections end up falling short. But the big problem with all of this is not one of demand. There's certainly worldwide demand for all of this new renewable energy. But in the US, recent testimony has shown that there really is no infrastructure in place to accommodate the transmission that's going to be required and the connection or the interconnection of these to the grid. So that's going to be problematic. And also problematic is there are not the workers to make this happen. In fact, in some of these testimonies, they've indicated that the workforce issue is an existential issue, that it's just simply not going to happen unless we get the people trained to do the installation. And that's the news from the solar industry for this week. So I know, Don, you had mentioned that you had, well, you sent me a copy of the report from the IRS about the EV incentive program. And I did try and read through that, and I'm more confused than I was before I read through it. Do you have any insights on that?
No, I'm confused too, but there's clearly, they said there's a 3-step process for figuring out your critical minerals percentage, a 4-step process for figuring out your battery components, that any country we have a free trade agreement with qualifies as if it were the US. And the countries that are bad countries are, I think, China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. So nothing from there, and China makes most of the batteries, so, but nothing from there qualifies. So figure out how you're going to get your batteries and your minerals.
Yeah, because that's very problematic. In fact, I found it kind of interesting with the fact that if we have a free trade agreement, it's the same as domestic production.
Yeah.
Because sort of the whole point of this was to bring the production here to the US.
Yeah, and that was very odd.
Yeah, and there were a lot of countries in there, most of Central America, a lot of South America, even countries like Singapore, Israel, Australia, you know how problematic Australians can be. So
they had all that. And then the one area that they did not cover was Europe, which they noted that even though people have talked about opening up to Europe, because I guess they're getting mad and going to have a free trade dispute with us over whether this is discriminatory, they were not included in the list.
Oh, okay. And that incentive program, there's like a $7,500 tax credit for EVs, but it's broken into those two parts. One part being sort of the mining of the materials that make up the components. And then the second part of it was that the components then themselves have to be manufactured here in the US. Is that right?
That's right. When you read the details, some of it is kind of odd because they say to figure each component has to be 50% in order to consider it, or 50% US by value to be considered US. But then you add those pieces together to get to the 40%, for example, for the minerals, for the US required content. And then they have a sliding scale by 2027, I think, for the batteries. Maybe it's going to go up to 100%. But since each of the components could be 50% that you add together to get to the 100%, I don't know exactly how much it's going to cover.
Yeah, but if each individual has to be 50% and the total has to be 40%, somebody lost 10% somewhere, didn't they?
Well, they're saying like each of the pieces you put together, like if you add together 5 different subcomponents to get to 40% of the value of the mineral or the battery or whatever, each of those little pieces you put together has to be at least 50%. So it depends on how you add them together.
Oh, okay. And I did see that about the value, and that seemed like that was ripe for, it wasn't total or volume. It was like, what is the perceived value of each component? And it's up to the manufacturer to determine the value of those.
I think that they will contest that it's more than the perceived value. Typically, in other contexts with the IRS, when you do value studies, you have to have some kind of a objective proof, like an appraisal, if you do transfer pricing studies or something. So
I remember seeing a podcast or listening to a podcast or something in that where they were complaining about that very thing in the manufacturing of a solar panel, and they were not providing value to the engineering and the design work and the intellectual processes that were part of the assembly process. They, the government was saying the value is in the minerals, the value is in the chips, the value is in the, cells or whatever. But the fact that you're just simply putting them together, the manufacturers are saying you're undervaluing that part. So.
I think that's right. And there's a piece about it that the IRS is focused on the components, not on the, like you said, the IP or whatever it takes to put it together and figure it out. The other piece is, I didn't read it closely enough to really understand it completely, but it said that here are all the things you do to list the value of the critical minerals, but we don't count processing. They counted some things. They counted certain processing, but they didn't count like thermal or chemical extraction. So they didn't count refining, it sounded like, or maybe they counted it someplace else. But it
okay,
was,
well, it sounds like there's still a lot to do, and I'm glad I'm not in that business. So. All right, well, let me jump into the announcements here.
Let me just jump in with a question and a comment, for which I doubt any of you will have the answer, but we put in a build order for a bolt on February 17th. We don't have a VIN number yet. Our understanding was that if you had a VIN number, you met the deadline, and now all the newspaper stuff says delivery by April 18th. Who's going to adjudicate this?
Are you talking about to qualify for a tax credit
Right.
last year with last
No,
year's
this would be a not yet built car. So it'd be, presumably we're at risk for half of it, and the bolt will be built in the US, so we get half of it no matter what. But it just sounds like, who's going to determine this? We don't want to have to be in small claims court.
Yeah,
you won't be. You'll be in tax court with the IRS.
So you have the presumption of guilt on your side there. So
well, if it looks like gold, it must be guilt. So that's we'll see.
Yeah, I mean, Don, isn't that true in the IRS tax court? You're presumed guilty until you prove yourself innocent.
It's civil, so it's not guilty. It's a civil thing. So you have the burden of proof, is the way I'd put it.
Yeah.
So you have to come up with 51%. So it's not a criminal court, so there's no guilt. It's just whether you win or lose.
Okay.
Sounds like fun. Okay.
All right. Okay, so let's talk about some of the announcements here. There are a bunch of these webinars, so I'm trying to keep everybody straight on it. And as I mentioned before, probably the easiest way of getting the access on this is to Google it now that you're aware that it exists. But if you need to, I can send you what I've got if you send me an email. Today, there's a USDA REAP grant, Rural Energy for whatever it is. Anyway, it's the grant program for commercial and rural and agricultural businesses. That's today at 2:30. Then there's one tomorrow, which is about charging station grants that are available out there. And that one is being put on here in Ohio. So I think it's for EV. I forget the name of the organization putting that one on. But it's, I'm having trouble reading my own screen there, but hopefully you can see it and find it. Then April 11th, we've got the NFPA 70 risk assessment changes. So 70E is the safety, the OSHA safety issues. We have a Reuters event coming up on April 12th. And this one has to do with energy storage systems. And they're saying management for solar, wind, and other energy storage systems. So that is one that's available. All of these are free, by the way. There's an upcoming one on the 12th as well at 1 p.m. This is EV charging management systems for workplaces and businesses. There's another webinar on April 12th at 2 p.m. These are Eastern time, navigating U.S. energy tax credits. So you can be more confused after you've attended that webinar than before. And then there's April 18th, there's one, 2 p.m., navigating solar structures. So I'm assuming that's racking systems. They were a bit unclear about that. And then Solar United Neighbors, which is a group that does like group purchasing of solar systems in different cities. They'll go out and put them to bid and you get a discount if you're part of that group. They're having a movie, an online movie thing, how to power a city. This is an anytime kind of thing, starts on the 17th through the 23rd. It's free, but if you want to give them some money, they're more than happy to accept it. So those were the announcements that I had for this week. Lots of webinars there. I'm hopefully going to get into that one this afternoon on the REAP grants, because that's something I deal with quite a lot. All right. Anybody have anything else to bring up before I jump into our topic? Give you just a second. All right. A couple of weeks ago, somebody had asked me to kind of try and outline some of the differences between residential solar installation and systems and commercial solar installations and systems. And I'm hoping that anyone on the call who does commercial systems and ideally have done both can chime in and correct me or add things to this. Because I know they're inherently similar from a conceptual standpoint. These systems, one of the nice things about solar is it's very scalable. Conceptually, there's very little difference between a rooftop system and a utility scale system. Just all the bits are bigger, systems are more complex. The voltages, certainly the amperages are going to be larger, but conceptually it is a scaled up kind of version of the residential system. So when I was looking through trying to find out or identify what is perceived in the industry to be the difference between commercial and residential, first thing comes up is the permitting process is quite a bit more complex, quite a bit more time consuming. That a residential system, you can oftentimes go start to finish within 4 to 12 weeks, 1 to 3 months, you'll be done with it. Whereas a commercial system, you're really looking at 6 months to a year to go through that process. And a lot of that is taken up in permitting, assessments by governmental officials, inspections, things of that nature. So that's one thing that comes up right off the bat. Second thing is that the equipment that you're going to be dealing with is a lot more complex, a lot bigger. You may find that you're dealing with switchgear like the picture here, where it's 2,000, 3,000 amps of power coming through these systems. A lot different than a 200 amp service panel in your house. So the complexity there, certainly touch the wrong wire and they're gonna find bits of you somewhere in the next county. So you really clearly need to know what you're doing. Certainly we'll be working with electricians for sure on most of that. There may also be the issue of transformer upgrades. So most of those transformers that are servicing the building, the residence or the commercial structure, they're going to be operating in the 16 to 100 kVA range, could be up as much as 200 kilovolt amps. But a commercial system, a large commercial system may certainly exceed 100 watts, 100 kilowatts. And if it does, then of course the capacity of the system back feeding onto the grid will exceed the capacity of the transformer. So the utility may require you to swap out to pay for the cost of exchanging out those transformers. And a study that I saw shows the average cost of doing that is in the $8,700 range, which isn't cheap. And I've heard some residential folks getting hit with these kind of bills as well, where they've got old equipment up there and the utility says, hey, you want to install this, you gotta pay for the upgrade of our transformer. Another thing you're going to run into is the three-phase voltage issues versus single phase. And so you might have to put like a pedestal or a pad transformer in to step down or perhaps even step up the voltages and the phase from what's coming from the utility. It's not uncommon to find a situation where the building might be being served with three-phase 480 service, but the inverters that you're wanting to install are three-phase 208 systems. So then you're going to have to put in some sort of transformer that's going to step down the voltages so that they're compatible with your array and your inverters, of course, for that. There's a lot more communication involved in a commercial install than in a residential. Typically in a residential, of course, you're dealing with the homeowner who is also the finance person and also, it's the one-stop shop. You're just dealing with them and you've got to manage their expectations. Well, in a commercial situation, you're dealing with different constituencies. You're going to be dealing with not only the client, perhaps management, you're going to have workers there. You're going to be disrupting their world. So you got to deal with that. You've got engineers, usually an engineering firm that's going to be involved in the design and the process of the install. These are oftentimes going to be on a flat roof, and those flat roofs may have warranty issues. So you might have to have engineers from the insurance company or whatever that you're messing with their roof. So we've had builds there where somebody's been sitting up on the roof, an engineer, just to monitor the roof during construction. Permitting issues, a lot of different permits may be required. A lot of different inspections may be required at different stages of the install. Financial people, whether it's internally financed or externally financed, there may be release of funds that take place throughout the project. So, it's not like, here's my bill. It may be when you get to this stage, the bank will release so much money. When you get to the next stage, the bank will release so much money. So there may be time pressures there that have to be communicated with everybody. You're going to be disrupting a business. usually during the installation process. And you'll need to coordinate that with everybody. You may also have to coordinate access issues. You know, can I get up onto the roof? Can I get into the business outside of normal business hours? What about parking issues? You know, a lot of different things that are going to have to be coordinated. So there's a lot more communication going on with that system. And of course, if you're not familiar with Gantt charts, you know, hopefully they'll become your best friend. And, you know, you're going to have to manage through this process. Every level gets a little bit more complex. So you have to see what are the things that are dependent upon the previous before I can move forward. What things can I be working on simultaneously? What's the time that's associated with each of these tasks? How does one delay impact the system going forward? So Gantt charts are something that, you know, as part of project management, you're going to have to get pretty familiar with. You know, it's a bigger system. It's high cost. There's a lot of money involved in these things. So it's high risk. You know, you have one client who doesn't pay you and it might put you out of business, you know, especially if you've had upfront the cost of all of the materials. So that's an issue that you've got to work through. You've got to deal with. What happens if you're halfway through the process and the client's financing, you know, falls through? Something like that. You get a credit crisis, for example, the Silicon Valley bank thing, if it were financed through them and then they all of a sudden default, you know, that's going to cause a lot of headaches as part of the installation process. Hopefully they'll get financed somewhere else, but they might not. So that's going to deal with your issue. On the reverse side, with commercial installs, there are a lot more incentives available to the client than there are in residential systems. The USDA REAP grant is a good example, where as part of this, as part of that program, it is available to rural businesses, which is any business in an area less than 50,000 people, and agricultural businesses. Well, it will pay up to 40% of the cost of the installation, but it is only viable on commercial builds. So then you've got to navigate through those grant provisions. Let's say, for example, you're putting it on a dairy farm and the homeowner happens to live there at the farm. They've got a house, but then they've got multiple barns, but they're all under 1 meter. So you may then have to arrange for separate meters to be installed as part of this process. Or you may be able to do it just simply by allocating, you know, 30% goes to the residents. That's something for the grant awarding agency to determine. So a lot of things there with the Inflation Reduction Act. Now with commercial incentives, there's 30% tax credit that applies to residential and commercial. There's a 10% tax credit that applies if it's domestically manufactured product, which, as we were discussing earlier, that can be a little nebulous, but it's also a little bit unclear right now whether that applies to residential as well as commercial. We know it'll apply to commercial systems, but does it apply for residential? We're not sure about that. Then there's, if you're in a low income area, that's a commercial incentive only, another 10%. If you're in a fossil fuel dependent area, that's another 10%, but only applies to commercial. If you're doing low income housing, well, that's clearly a commercial install for a low income development. So there's these incentives that are there only for businesses. So that's a positive when you're out there installing. And then finally, we're getting to the system itself. You know, where does the system itself differ when you do the install? And typically with a larger system, with a commercial system, you're going to be installing bigger panels, 72 cell panels, as opposed to 60 cell panels, for example, that you might, although you know, some people are installing the 72s on residential as well. These systems are large. They can be very large. Really, a medium range system is considered between 10 and 100 kilowatts. A large commercial system would be more than 100 kilowatts. So these things can be big, and you can run into some interesting problems. I know I've mentioned in the past one installer that had been through the course. He was concerned because when they designed the install, they didn't take into account the width of the bolts that are between the panels. And by the time he got to the end of the row, there wasn't enough of an aisleway. It had eaten up. You're supposed to have a 4-foot or even in some cases an 8-foot aisleway. And it had eaten into there by a couple of feet, just adding up all of the 1/2-inch bolts that weren't accounted for. So, a lot of issues there to worry about as far as that. With the larger systems, you're typically working on a flat roof. So from a flat roof perspective, you're going to be dealing with ballasted systems. You're hoisting up a lot of weight there. It's not a lot of weight per square foot, but you're going to be bringing up pallets of concrete blocks, perhaps, pallets of course, the panels, the racking system. So you've got to learn and be familiar with ballasted systems. There are some wire management issues that are unique to these. So you're going to have to pick your favorite system and get familiar with that. And then, of course, your equipment is typically going to be located up there on the roof as well. So you're just going to be dealing with perhaps very large inverters, multiple inverters, a lot of different situations that you wouldn't find yourself with within a residential system. And if you've got multiple arrays, multiple sub-arrays, you've got to worry about backfeeding from one array to another if there's a ground fault. So those are things, they're not deal killers. They're just things you're going to have to be aware of as you're designing the system that you would put fusing in, to protect all of the different systems. And I think those were the things I identified. Did anybody, as I was meandering through these, have anything they want to add to that?
Jay from Trinidad and dealing with some of the Caribbean islands. When large-scale systems are proposed, commercial are like 100 kilowatts and above, sometimes the utility companies want to classify the system in a different category. So, for example, St. Lucia might say anything above 100 kilowatt, it should be classified as an independent power provider company plant. And when they do that, obviously the tariff rate, the feed-in rate is different.
Yeah. So you're saying that these larger systems in your world, they want to just say you're a utility now.
Yeah.
Pretty much. That's nasty. So, yep. Any other comments?
Hey, Jay.
Yeah.
In commercial and industrial sites, you talked a lot about thin film panels.
Yes.
Now, I did some cursory investigations, and I'm finding monolithic panels beat the price of the thin films. Does that sound right, or am I on the wrong path?
I think when you're saying that the crystalline, the silicon-based ones are cheaper actually than the thin film panels.
Yeah, I'm asking that question.
Yeah, I think that's been, well, when you're talking about commercial, industrial, and residential, that's true. Most of the thin film manufacturing has been geared towards the utility scale systems, and you would not have access to buy those. You would have to be a utility and go direct to First Solar or some company like that. But now that's changing a little bit with Toledo Solar has just this year gotten into the commercial and industrial marketplace with that same technology, with the cadmium telluride thin film. And I did see, I think it was even Renvu, where they're offering those panels. The downside I saw were those panels were only like 120 watt, and I'm thinking, really? That's, I don't quite, they make the case that they're cheaper and they produce better and all of that, but I'd have to spend some time looking at it. I'd hate to have to install 3 panels for the price of 1. You know, it's like 3 different installs, 3 different panels, a lot more labor to put 3 120 watt panels rather than put 1 360 watt panel. So,
Because I've seen medium-sized installs in my research that are doing still monolithic, and
yeah, I think that's true. And of course, most of the racking systems that are out there are still geared towards silicon panels. And you know, so you'd have to buy like a Toledo Solar racking system because they clamp differently, they're installed differently. So I think silicon is the way you're going to go for quite a while. Still, you know, quite a while might be 3 or 4 years in the world of solar. That's a long time. I see Pete has raised his hand there. Pete.
Separately from this discussion, I was involved during the weekend on discussion on module level rapid shutdown. So how does that apply to a commercial system, and what would happen with 3 times as many 120 watt panels versus a now traditional 360 watt panel? How would that work out?
Yeah, it would work out with very expensive module level power electronics, wouldn't it? I think most of these systems that we're talking about with the thin film are ground mounted systems. So it's not an issue because rapid shutdown doesn't apply to ground mounted systems.
Correct.
But yeah, if you're putting it on a rooftop, on a flat roof, you're pretty much having to install a electronic device to each panel. And so I don't think that would be very practical, at least right now.
Not on 120 watt panels. That would be fatal.
No, it would be, yeah, certainly cost prohibitive, I would say. And Pete, was it you who had sent me an email? I don't remember. Somebody had asked me about utility scale costs.
Yes, you talked about it last week being something in the range of $100 or $1.10 a watt, but I don't remember the discussion on whether that was east-west fixed or north-south single axis tracking.
Yeah, it's I looked at what CEA's number is because I think the thing I mentioned didn't make that distinction. And CEA, the Solar Energy Industries Association, they're claiming at the moment it's 91 cents a watt fixed and $1 tracking. So that's their number. Other numbers I've seen, they range anywhere from 77 cents a watt to $1.30 a watt. So, you know, it's really going to depend on the install. But these were CEA's average costs as of the 4th quarter of 2022 was 91 cents a watt fixed and $1.01 tracking.
yeah, but these are systems that are quite large, economy of scale.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, certainly the cost. In fact, the average cost of these systems, they're going to be like megawatt size systems. And so they're going to be in the $800,000 to $1 million, $800,000 to $1 million. And really costing about $500,000 an acre, depending on how many acres of these things you put in.
yeah. Well, I'm looking to do office buildings in Chicago, and the amount of territory on top of those roofs are not very large.
Yeah, and of course we won't be doing utility scale. That's just a whole different world. But you're right. One of the things about commercial is you've got to treat the space on the roof as valuable real estate, because that's kind of their limitation. So how do you maximize the return on that investment? So typically you're going to put higher efficiency panels up there. And you may even go with one of those east-west racking systems where they're like pyramids, where the panels face east and west. That way you can get more panels and less space. Problem with those systems, though, is oftentimes you get puddling and things like that up on a roof like that. And so wire management is really difficult because the profile is very low and you're having to try and get that wire so it doesn't drape down into pools of water that might form up on the roof. So.
Yeah, most of the system seems to be either 5 degree or 10 degree.
Yeah, Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah. Devanan, do you have a comment?
Yeah, I was just about to ask you. If you have a campus, right, like a facility like a university or multiple buildings on site, and let's say these spaces on these roof are limited to like about 6, 7, 8 kilowatts individually. But you go ahead and design a proposal to do the whole campus that amounts to over a couple hundred kilowatts. You still fall that in line with commercial, or how you treated that? So what I'm saying is that individual buildings will have their own inverter going into their own connections, but aggregated wise, it's pretty large.
Yes. And sometimes what you're saying is that if I've got multiple buildings, the project itself may be very large, but each individual building might only be, 10 kW or something like that.
Yes.
So how is that treated? And a lot of that's going to be dependent upon the utility itself. Now I know it's different in Trinidad, but here in the US, sometimes it's very difficult to get the utility to aggregate the billing. So you might be treating them like multiple smaller arrays, even though it's all part of one contract. But if you can aggregate it, then the permitting might be similar to a larger commercial system. Any other questions?
Well, Trinidad does have a 112 megawatt project supposed to begin by the end of the year. I did actually send you a PDF document on the plan layout of that installation. So that was something that I shared with you if you just wanted to look at it.
Okay, are you going to be installing the 112 megawatt system?
Well, actually, this is a project was by BP, Shell, Lighthouse, and if you know of them.
Yeah.
Right. So they contracted an EPC company in Spain called Grupotec, who they awarded the contract to do the installation. And that company in turn now contracted local engineering companies in terms of the manpower, installation, supporting the installation, probably afterwards operation and maintenance. So one of the companies actually have me on board and asked me to work with them on the review of the plan. Of course, utility scale is not my forte, but still, it was interesting that they asked me to come on board and to have a look at it.
Okay, well, you can share with us later all of the challenges you found with
definitely.
utility scale systems.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, any comments here before we call it a day? Okay, hearing none, let's call it a day. We'll see you guys next week. All right, take care. Bye-bye.